In this video, I take over $200 worth of steel and turn it into the nicest knife I've ever made, despite almost trashing the entire thing along the way. Stick around and see how I did it. This project begins with me cutting down these 4-foot bars into 6-inch pieces using my porta band. The porta band is such a great tool to have, especially if you have a smaller shop space like mine. Something about cutting up $200 worth of perfectly flat and usable steel, only to forge it back together and make it flat again, just seems so counterintuitive. But you have to try and not think like that and hope the results make it all worth it. I bought this steel wide surface ground, so that saves me a lot of time having to grind off all the mill scale to ensure clean welds. However, a slight burr forms from cutting the pieces on the bandsaw, so I quickly hit each piece on the grinder so they stack up flush against each other. For this stack, I'm using 15N20 and 1084 at an even ratio, with the initial billet count being 32 layers. Next is one of my favorite parts of this process, which is welding. These welds just hold everything in place and prevent the billet from blowing apart before they can be fully forge welded under the press. What you see me do here is grind off the weld bead. This is so I don't press it down into the billet and have a nasty weld line in the finished steel. Next is the most satisfying process of this, which is heating the bar to well over 2000 degrees and squishing it under 25 tons of force to bond everything together. At this point, those individual 32 pieces are now one solid chunk of metal. I think it's so cool how you can just fuse pieces of steel together by applying a little heat to them. I mean, a little heat probably isn't the best way to describe something that's over 2000 degrees hot, but you get my point. Science is cool. I decided to do a little mini test of cutoff wheels throughout the length of this project. Usually I use Blackhawk disc from Amazon, and for about $1 a disc, I feel like it's a good buy for the money. Right here, I'm using a disc from Harbor Freight, which, spoiler alert, I am not a huge fan of at all. They don't last very long, and I was actually using one today at my side job, and this was after all this video was filmed, and the disc actually sheared off from the internal bushing, completely off the grinder, and that's a pretty big hazard, so I would not recommend using the Harbor Freight disc at all. The Blackhawk discs are definitely a good bang for your money, but later on you'll see me use a purple disc on the grinder, and that's a 3M Cubitron, which is about $10 a disc, so I'm not 100% sure if that's going to be worth the money compared to the Blackhawks, but it's something I want to try, and if it's worth the extra money, I'm going to start using those from now on. So I'll let you know how I make out with that. If you're an average Joe with no knife making experience and just here to see me make something, you're probably enjoying seeing how the steel is shaped and worked. Well, at least I hope you're enjoying it. However, if you're someone with a little bit of knife making background, you might be curious why I'm forging and cutting the steel in different ways like I am. So let me break down how I'm going to manipulate this bar into the finished pattern. So we began with our initial flat stack of 32 layers. We forge welded all those together into one solid bar, and then I turned that bar on the corners and forged them in. This made the layers run diagonally across the bar, and also made them cup in a C shape. I then flattened this bar into a rectangle, and what's left was a rectangular bar with opposing C shapes. I cut that bar in half, and then cut it into 6 pieces and stacked them on top of each other. I forge welded this bar down, and that created a square bar with condensed C's. Then I forged that bar on the corners again to make the pattern run diagonally across the billet. I cut that bar into 4 equal pieces, which is what you are seeing me do here, and four-weight them with the pattern running opposing directions to create kind of a exploding look to the billet. I forge welded these together, and then I cut that last billet into 5 pieces and welded all of them together to create the pattern to go the length of the blade. If everything I just said confused you and overcomplicated things, I totally understand and I'm sorry for that. I confuse myself and have a habit of overcomplicating things all the time. So what I'm going to do is show you progressions of the pattern after each weld, like I just did there before, to help you visualize and see how the pattern of the steel is developing. So going back to the topic of welding, I've been working some overtime lately to help fabricate training props for my job, and I decided to invest a little bit of this extra income towards acquiring more tools and equipment to help grow my fabrication skill set. So I just bought myself a 3M speed glass welding helmet, and this one has an auto darkening lens, which if you're not too familiar with welding, an auto darkening lens, like the name applies, lets you see clearly through the lens and then it darkens once you strike an arc. And I can't believe I was getting away with using a fixed shade lens up until now. And as promised, because I'm a man of my word, here's a look at the progress after that last round of forge welding. I will cut this bar into 5 tiles, and it will be the final forge weld before using the steel to make a knife out of. Sometimes metal dust builds up in the forge after heavy grinding, and it explodes. No biggie really, we're just going to try to not do that again in the future. So the billet expanded due to the heat, and it barely made it out of the forge here. Luckily I was able to avoid that problem, but this is the point in the project where things start to go a bit sideways. By the way, there's that Cubitron disc I was talking about. Did it perform better than the Blackhawks? For sure. Is it worth 10 times the price though? I don't think so. I discovered a pretty visible seam at one of the weld joints. I need to address this before moving forward, otherwise that seam will get more pronounced the more I stretch the material, and the entire billet will become trash. So I use some regular household borax to clean the joint, then bring the billet back up to a welding heat and attempt to forge the area shut. I began to notice a few other cracks and cold shuts forming along the edge of the bar, so I stopped forging completely and ground all of them out before resuming. The cracks might seem small to you, but if not properly addressed, they will turn into a much bigger problem down the road. Fortunately, it looks like everything forged out cleanly, so now I need to figure out a way to cut the bar cleanly in half since it's currently way too thick to make a chef's knife out of. It would be much safer to just grind this billet to the thickness I need on the surface grinder, but I have a lot of time and money into making this steel, so I'm going to try to take the risk of splitting it evenly in two so I can make multiple knives from it. Well, the grinder that I've had for about 10 years died on me. My parents gave it to me when I graduated 8th grade, and I've put a lot of miles on it. Now I have to use my other grinder that doesn't have a guard, and since I can't seem to find my face shield anywhere, I decided to throw on the welding helmet. Mostly to feel cool, but also to protect the eyes too, I guess. Once I had a pretty deep guide groove around the entire bar with the cutoff wheel, I used my porter band to slice through the rest of the way. This took forever, but I'm actually surprised how cleanly and centered I was able to split this bar. With a quick hit on the surface grinder, these are both two very usable pieces of steel. quick test etch, and this pattern is looking awesome. I am super excited to start working on the knife. I just want to take a minute here too and show you just how dirty the shop gets for making knives. I do a thorough vacuuming after every build, so all of this dust is just from this knife. If you have any tips or tricks for keeping the shop clean, please let me know. I'd love to hear them. At this point, I was still a little undecided what blade shape I wanted this knife to have. I decided to go with a Nakiri since it's something I've never made before and I thought it would complement this Damascus pattern really well. Usually I don't like straight square lines on my knives, but the Nakiri is a very specific, functional knife shape and I didn't want to mess with that at all. I'll add my own touch to this knife in another way further in the build. I used to eyeball grinding the lines and profile of a knife, and sometimes I still will. But as I've progressed, I've learned that laying out some precise lines with a thin tip scribe goes a long way to make sure everything looks proportional. For kitchen knives, I like to heat treat before I grind the bevels, since it's a little more forgiving with a thinner material. And crisis strikes again. Coming out of the first normalizing cycle, I already have a good warp in the blade. I'm going to try to do what I can to straighten it, but from my experience, I found that once a blade warps once, it's gonna warp again. Heat treat is one of those things where prep is key. Kind of like the quote from Abe Lincoln: "Give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe." If you take the proper steps, you normalize, use the correct oil, preheat your oil, etc., everything should go smoothly. And I use the word should very lightly here. And straight out of the quench, this knife had a sizable warp in it like I expected. So I tempered the blade once so the steel isn't as brittle, then clamp it to a piece of angle iron to straighten it out for a second tempering cycle. This actually got a good amount of the warp out, but not completely. To straighten the warp the rest of the way, I use a carbide tipped hammer and peen the inside of the curve ever so slightly. What this does is it stretches the material and it causes it to curve in the opposite direction, thus straightening the bend. With this thinner stock, it's important that I straighten it before surface grinding, because if I were to just pop this on the surface grinder, the magnetic chuck will bend the bar straight, but once I take it off, it will flex back to its naturally curved state again. Then onto the surface grinder to get the knife planed down to its final thickness. Well, the knife entered the surface grinder straight, but it unfortunately did not leave that way. Sometimes when you grind through decarb, the blade has internal stresses that are relieved, and that can cause it to pull one way or another. So a little more peening with the carbide hammer, and we are good to go, for now. Like I said, once a blade warps once, it's going to warp again, or in this case, again and again. I use a disc grinder to flatten out the bottom of the edge before grinding the bevels. It's very important that I keep the edge flat so it makes full contact with the cutting board and makes a clean cut through whatever is being sliced. Next begins the very tedious process of bevel grinding. I need to remain very diligent, especially with this thinner blade stock, because it's very easy to slip and create a big gouge in the blade that can't be ground out. It's also critical that both sides of the knife are ground even to ensure proper performance when cutting. Once the steel is roughly 65 thousandths of an inch thick, about 5/8 inch or so up the bevel, I know I'm at a good geometry where the knife is thin enough to slice well, but has enough meat behind the edge to remain robust. To aid in slicing performance and food release, I'm going to convex the bevels in an apple seed shape. The idea is that no part of the bevel will be flat, which will reduce friction and prevent sticky materials like potatoes from hanging on the edge so easily. I'll grind a light taper towards the spine, then begin to round everything out and blend it all together. Then, all that's left is to clean up and round off the hard edges and ensure the back of the ricasso is flat and parallel for handle fit up. Before, I said that bevel grinding was a very tedious process, and some knife makers might argue that hand sanding is even more tedious. I would actually have to disagree with this. As long as you do a good job at the grinder, all you should really have to do during hand sanding is remove scratches. When you're establishing the bevels at the grinder, your mind can't really wander, you need to focus. When you're hand sanding, you don't need anywhere near that range of focus. You can kind of zone out and do your thing. With that said, hand sanding can definitely be a long process, and it's important that you get every single scratch out from the grinder. I like to sand the 400 grit before doing the first etch. A lot of people see my mark in the blade and ask if I can put their names, initials, or logos on the blade as well. And while I could, many knife makers and collectors would agree that this should not be done. Think of it like having a signed Mickey Mantle baseball card, only to have someone's name written on it too. It reduces the value and desirability of the piece. But what do you guys think? Should I start offering customization on these higher end knives? At this point, I'm absolutely stoked with how this knife is coming out. After a quick hit with 1000 grit paper, the pattern is looking sweet. For the handle, I'm using this piece of African blackwood that I've had for probably about 2 or 3 years now. I've just always been afraid to use it because of that void that you can see in the bottom corner there. But for this knife, it's going to work out perfect. I'm using a drill bit called a plug cutter to create a 3/8 inch dowel out of this piece of African blackwood. Since this knife is only about 75 thousandths thick, it's hard for me to drill a hole deep enough and with tight enough tolerances for the tang to fit in. So I'm going to drill a 3/8 inch hole through the block, cut the dowel I just made in half, taper those two pieces, then drive each one on either side of the knife to make a seamless transition. I've never done this before, so I'm really hoping it works. Have I lost fingernails doing what I do next? Yes. I decided that a stainless spacer about a third of the way down the handle would be a nice accent to complement the shiny parts of the Damascus. So I cut the block in two pieces, and I'm using the carbide guide to sand the mating surface completely flat. These carbide guides are so useful for so many different tasks and definitely well worth the money. Since the tang doesn't go super deep in the back half of the handle, I'm able just to mill out that slot with a 1/8 inch end mill. And I do the same thing for the stainless spacer as well. Now it's time to glue the block together and bed the tang. I want the handle pieces to bond fully together, but I don't want the tang to stick so that I can pull the knife out and shape the handle separately. To do this, I coat the tang in a paste wax. Then once that dries, I apply a top coat of Vaseline. And I use G-Flex epoxy for the win here. This stuff is definitely the best of the best. I mix some black dye in with the epoxy to seal any tiny gaps if there are any. Nimble fingers is the trick here. Trying to get epoxy residue off your hands is a pain in the butt. Ask me how I know. Then I drive in those pins I made. After clamping up the knife, I went on the rest of my day, and when I was trying to go to sleep that night, it dawned on me that maybe I shouldn't have driven those pins in so tight. I was stressing so much that I may have unintentionally wedged the knife in the block and that I wasn't going to be able to separate it in the morning. These are the things about being a maker that many people neglect to realize. Well, morning came, so I tried to pop the knife out. Definitely got some sweat dripping from my forehead. That's for sure. I gave the handle a couple shocks with a hammer to loosen things, and then tried to pull the knife out. And as I predicted, she stuck. It's wedged in there. I had to take a breath, walk away for a few, then came back to try again. Luckily, and to my surprise, I was able to break the handle free this time. That was definitely a huge sigh of relief. I don't know why, but something about this clip is just so satisfying. I was going to do a traditional wah style handle on this, but I wanted to add a little touch of my style. So instead, I'm using a handle shape and design that I really enjoy for kitchen knives. It looks classy and it feels great in multiple grips, including the pinch grip. And that Porter band's coming in clutch once again to rough out the profile of the handle. A surface plate and a height gauge is once again one of those things where you don't realize how good it is until you have it. As I work the handle block, I need to take it slow and steady to prevent the block from heating up and causing the pieces to separate. I use a fresh belt and occasionally splash a few drops of water on the handle to keep things cool. And she came apart anyways. I reattached everything together with epoxy and tried working the block again. This time, everything held together. I was thinking about adding guide pins to the pieces, but I was afraid that as I grind the fuller into the block, the pins would risk being exposed. So I decided to stick with epoxy. As long as it holds together so I can shape the block, it'll be perfectly serviceable and plenty supported once the tang is glued in. There's a small void in this piece of wood, so I'm just using a couple drops of super glue here. Then I sand everything flush and it seals everything up perfectly. And now the fun process of hand sanding. I'll hand sand the handles to 600 grit. Usually I sand to 400 grit on the grinder, then hand sand straight to 600 grit, and then give it a buff on the buffer with pink scratchless compound. And this creates a really nice sheen that's very durable on the handle. Then I just touch up the blade, give it another etch or two, and for this one I'm going with a low contrast. The reason why I'm going with a low contrast is because one, I think it's going to look good with this bold pattern, and two, I found with like coffee etches or other ways where you kind of make a high contrast, the oxides come off super easily, and that's kind of a pain if you're cutting through vegetables and food that you're going to be consuming, because now that black oxide goes all over your food, and that's not cool. We're getting down to the nitty gritty here. I drilled a small hole at the end of the tang to act as a grab for epoxy, and I degrease everything before glue up for a durable bond. At one point, I would literally watch the glue dry for close to an hour so I can clean any squeeze out until the epoxy set. A cool trick I found that works really well is to just wipe a bunch of Vaseline near the handle transition with a Q-tip. The Vaseline creates a barrier the epoxy can't get past, and it also ensures that any existing epoxy residue won't bond to the blade. My down and dirty sharpening method is a one and done 2000 grit stone. This Shapton glass is a super nice feeling stone and produces a great edge for the kitchen. If a customer prefers a more polished, higher grit edge, it's something they can easily do to their liking with their home stones. To protect the blade from acidic foods and moisture, I apply a coat of wicked wax, which will also add a nice sheen to the blade. And she is sharp. You can see how thin I'm able to get some of these slices off the cucumber. And here's the final knife. I'm super proud of this one. I've been making knives since I was 13, and this is definitely the nicest one I've made so far. I hope you enjoyed seeing this process, and if you did, a subscribe and a like will go a long way to help support my channel. Thanks for watching.